Mabel Hartwell did not cry when they threw the rotten tomato at her back. She did not cry when the women on Main Street covered their mouths and laughed. She did not cry when Calvin Roswell pointed at her from across the road and said, loud enough for the whole town to hear, "Lord have mercy. Who sold that woman the idea she deserved a piece of land in Red Creek?" She kept walking, jaw tight, hands trembling at her sides. But when she finally reached her door and it swung shut behind her, Mabel Hartwell sank to the floor and cried like something inside her had finally given up the fight. If this story already has your heart subscribed to this channel, hit that notification bell and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. Because what happens next changed everything. She had been in Red Creek for exactly 19 days before the town made up its mind about her. 19 days was all it took. Mabel Hartwell arrived on a Tuesday in late June of 1884, riding in the back of a freight wagon with everything she owned packed into 2 trunks and a canvas sack. She wasn't the kind of woman who made an entrance. She didn't flutter or call attention to herself. She stepped down from that wagon quietly, paid the driver without haggling, and stood in the middle of the main road of Red Creek, Montana Territory, looking at the town like she was taking its measure the same way it was already taking hers. And it didn't take long. The first person to notice her was Ida Pruitt, wife of the dry goods merchant, standing outside the general store with 2 other women whose names didn't matter then and wouldn't matter later. Ida Pruitt looked at Mabel, looked at the full width of her shoulders, the heaviness of her frame. The simple brown dress that had been washed so many times the color had gone soft at the elbows, and she turned to the woman beside her and said something low, and both of them smiled. Mabel heard it. She always heard it. A woman who had been talked about her whole life developed a particular sharpness for the sound of her own ridicule, even at a distance. She picked up her canvas sack, lifted her chin, and walked toward the land office. She had $43, a deed to an abandoned homestead 2 miles east of town, and exactly 0 intention of asking anyone in Red Creek for a single thing. The land office clerk was a young man named Percy Hatch, no older than 22, with the self-important bearing of someone who had never worked a difficult day but had been told many times that he was very clever. He looked at Mabel across the counter, and then looked at the deed she placed in front of him, and then looked back at Mabel. "You're the one who bought the Granger property," he said. "That's right, by yourself. Last I checked." Percy Hatch pressed his lips together like he was resisting something. "Ma'am, that land hasn't had a functioning well in 4 years. The cabin roof is half caved in. The fencing's rotted through on the north side and the east side both. The last 2 families that tried to work that land gave up inside of a season." "I'm not those families," Mabel said. He looked at her for another moment, that particular kind of look that men gave women they'd already decided weren't serious, and then he stamped her deed and slid it back across the counter. "No," he said quietly, "I don't suppose you are." She didn't know if it was an insult or a compliment. She didn't particularly care either way. She took the deed, folded it carefully into her coat pocket, and walked back out into the June heat. The road back to her property was 2 miles of dry Montana earth, baked pale under a sun that didn't apologize for anything. Mabel walked all of it on foot, pulling a small cart she'd borrowed from the freight driver. Loaded with her 2 trunks and the canvas sack and a set of tools she'd purchased at the general store, while Ida Pruitt and her companions watched from the other side of the road. She didn't look at them, not once. When she reached the property, she stopped at the gate, what remained of the gate, which was really just a post sideways in the dirt with a rusted hinge still attached, and she looked at what she'd spent everything she had to own. The cabin was worse than Percy Hatch had described, which was saying something. The roof had not merely caved in on one side, it had surrendered. 2 of the 4 walls still stood with confidence. The other 2 were having serious doubts about their futures. The well was dry and cracked. The garden plot was choked with scrub and hardpan. The fence along the north boundary was so rotted that a firm wind could have finished what years of neglect had started. Mabel stood there for a long moment. Then she set down her cart, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. She didn't tell herself it was going to be easy. She had never had the luxury of lying to herself about hard things. She told herself instead that she had survived worse, and she had. She had survived a childhood spent being the fat daughter that nobody knew how to love properly. She had survived her 20s in a boarding house in Billings, where the other women were kind enough not to say cruel things to her face, which left plenty of room for them to say cruel things everywhere else. She had survived 3 years working for a family who treated her fairly enough as hired help and barely registered that she was human. She had survived all of that. She could survive a leaning wall and a dry well. That first week, Mabel slept under the part of the roof that still held, wrapped in her quilt, listening to Montana nights talk to each other in wind and insect sound and distant coyote. She woke before dawn and worked until dark. She cleared the scrub from the garden plot with her bare hands and a borrowed hoe. She shored up the 2 compromised walls with timber she cut herself from the stand of pine at the property's edge, notching and fitting each piece with a slow, methodical patience that would have surprised people who assumed a woman her size moved slowly in all things. She was not slow. She was deliberate. There was a difference, and it mattered. By the end of the first week, she had a roof that no longer leaked in 2 places, a garden plot cleared and ready for seed, and hands so calloused they'd stopped hurting. She had also confirmed what she already suspected: Red Creek was not going to make this easy. The well repair was beyond her current skill and tools, which meant she needed to haul water from the creek half a mile south. This required 2 trips a day with the cart, which required walking through the edge of town, which required 20 people who had already made their opinions of her clear without ever having spoken to her directly. She learned their names without meaning to: Ida Pruitt and her companions. Calvin Roswell, who owned the largest merchant operation in town and seemed to feel that this gave him the right to comment on anything he considered beneath the standards of Red Creek and Mabel Hartwell. In his estimation, qualified as beneath those standards from the first moment he laid eyes on her. He was a tall man, well-dressed, with silver-streaked hair and the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. He said things that were just barely too quiet to be direct, but just barely loud enough to be heard. Running the Granger place alone, he'd said to the man beside him the second time Mabel walked past with her water cart, "Lord, what do you suppose she thinks is going to happen? Woman like that." Woman like that. She had heard that phrase her whole life in 100 variations. Woman like you, a girl like her, someone in her position. It always meant the same thing. We have decided what you are, and we have decided it from the outside, and we see no reason to look any deeper than that. Mabel kept walking. She kept working. By the end of the 3rd week, she had purchased seed on a line of credit from a farm supplier in town, not from Calvin Roswell's store, which she would not enter if she could help it, but from a smaller operation run by a quiet man named Henderson, who did not comment on her appearance and accepted her carefully written credit agreement with a nod and a handshake. She had planted the first rows of her garden. She had reinforced the north fencing to the point where it would keep animals out through at least 1 season. She had carried water 14 times without asking anyone for assistance. And she had not cried, not once, not until the tomato. It was a market day. The road into town was more crowded than usual, wagons and horses, and people moving in both directions, the particular noise and press of a community doing its weekly business. Mabel was coming back from Henderson's with seed packets and a small tin of nails tucked in her coat, and she was moving along the edge of the road the way she always did, quietly, efficiently, not looking for engagement with anyone, when something hit her between the shoulder blades. It was soft and wet and cold. She stopped walking. She knew what it was before she turned. The smell told her. Overripe and split open, the particular sourness of a tomato gone bad. It had hit her squarely and left a dark, wet stain spreading across the back of her brown dress. The laughter started half a second later. She turned and looked. There were 3 young men, boys, really 17 or 18 at most, standing near the mouth of the alley beside Roswell's store. One of them was still grinning, with the bright, thoughtless energy of someone who had just done something he thought was funny. She couldn't see which one had thrown it. It didn't matter. What mattered was Calvin Roswell himself, standing on the boardwalk not 30 feet away watching. He had seen it happen. He looked directly at Mabel with those sharp merchant's eyes. And he did nothing. He turned and walked back into his store. Mabel looked at the boys. She looked at the people nearby who had gone carefully and deliberately unaware of what had just happened. She looked at the wet stain on her back, which she couldn't see but could feel cold and spreading into the cloth. She turned around and she kept walking. She made it all the way home before she allowed herself to feel it. And then she sat down on the floor of her half-repaired cabin, pressed her back against the wall she'd shored up with her own hands, and she really cried. The kind of crying she almost never permitted herself because it didn't change anything, and it didn't build anything, and it cost her energy she couldn't afford to waste. But she cried anyway for a while, then she stopped. Wiped her face with the back of her hand, changed her dress. Went back out to finish the fencing. That was the 19th day. The man named Elias Whitaker had been ranching the land to Mabel's west for 11 years, and in those 11 years he had watched the Granger property pass through 3 families and rot back into hardpan each time. He had not paid it any particular attention when the deed changed hands again. He had enough of his own land to manage, enough of his own problems to carry, and had developed over the years a reliable policy of not involving himself in situations that weren't his business. He was a big man, broad through the chest, weathered in the specific way of men who spent their lives working outdoors, with hands that had mended fence and managed cattle, and done the 1,000 unglamorous tasks that keeping land alive required. He was 41 years old. He had dark hair going silver at the temples. He had a face that wasn't particularly hard or particularly soft, but had the settled look of someone who had made peace with the fact that life was going to cost him something no matter what he did. He had learned that lesson the hard way. His wife, Clara, had died 7 years ago, one winter that came in harder than expected. His daughter, she had been 3 years old, and her name had been Rose, had followed 3 months later from the fever that went through the valley that year. After that, Elias had closed down most of the rooms and himself and put the rest of his energy into the ranch. He kept his affairs clean. He did his work. He was fair with his hands and decent to his neighbors. He did not permit himself to want things that could be taken away. He saw Mabel for the first time on a Tuesday morning in early July, 2.5 miles from his own barn. He was riding the western boundary of his property on his horse, a roan named Bishop, doing the kind of slow inspection that the perimeter required every few weeks. When he came over a low rise and looked across the fence line and saw a woman on the adjacent property struggling to carry a fence post twice her height up a slope of loose shale. She was not making it easy on herself. The post was unwieldy and the footing was bad and the sun was already high enough to be brutal. But she was not stopping. Elias pulled Bishop to a halt and watched for a moment. She was large. He noticed that the way you noticed any clear physical fact, without particular judgment attached to it, and she was wearing a practical work dress hitched up above her boots, and her hair was pinned back in the no-nonsense way of someone who was not concerned with how it looked. She had the post up to shoulder height now, fighting the angle of the slope, her boots digging into the shale for purchase. The shale shifted. She went down hard, not all the way down, caught herself on one knee, and the post came down with her, the top end, swinging and catching her across the shoulder. She made a sound, not quite a cry, more of a sharp, involuntary exhale, the kind of sound you made when pain arrived faster than dignity could manage it. Elias was off Bishop and moving before he'd made a conscious decision to move. He came through the fence line at the low point where 2 posts had loosened, stepped across onto her property, and was up the slope to her before she'd gotten back to her feet. "Let me get that," he said. She looked up at him, and there was something in her face in that first moment that he recognized without being able to name it immediately. Not just pain, not just surprise. Something that had been braced for a long time against something specific and had not expected to be offered help and didn't quite know what to do with the offer. "I've got it," she said. "You've got a bruised shoulder and a post in the wrong position," he said. "Let me take the post." I said, "I've got it." He stopped. looked at her carefully. "I heard you," he said. "I'm asking anyway. Because that post is heavy, and the slope is bad, and your shoulder's hurting. I've got no other motive than a fence post that needs to be set and a neighbor with a sensible look about her." She studied him for a moment with those direct eyes the color of creek water over dark stone, he noticed, though he didn't say so. She was taking his measure the same careful way she'd taken the town's measure that first day. Looking for the angle, looking for what he actually wanted. "Elias Whitaker," he said, and touched his hat. "I run the Whitaker Ranch on the property west of yours." "Mabel Hartwell," she said. "I know whose property you run. I've seen your cattle at the fence line. Then you know I've got no reason to bother you except that post looks like it's giving you trouble." Another long moment. Then something shifted in her jaw, not quite softening, but releasing some of the brace. "Fine," she said. "Set it in the post hole at the top of the rise." "I'll tamp it." He carried the post. She tamped it. They worked in silence for a while, which was the kind of silence that didn't require filling. "You've done a considerable amount of work on this place," he said after a time. 3 weeks, she said. "It was worse when I arrived." "I know. I've watched that cabin deteriorate for 4 years. He looked at the repaired walls, the cleared garden plot, the new fencing running along the north boundary. "You did all of this yourself? Who else would do it?" He didn't have an answer to that. He moved the next post to the correct position and held it steady while she went back down the slope for the tamping bar. "The roof's going to need more work before winter," he said when she came back up. "I know what the roof needs, the east corner especially. That ridge beam is Mr. Whitaker." She set the tamping bar against the post and looked at him. "I have a list. The roof is on it, the well is on it. The barn foundation is on it. I know what needs to be done on this property." "I'm sure you do," he said with no particular apology. "I'm also sure that some of it is going to be harder to do alone before October than it would be with a second set of hands." "I've been doing it alone, you have," he said. "That's not in question." "I'm saying you don't have to." She looked at him again with those creekwater eyes, and there it was again, that guarded thing, that long-braced thing, looking for the angle, looking for what it was going to cost her. "What do you want in exchange?" she said. "I've got 2 hands who can be spared on Tuesdays and some Thursdays. I could have them over here working with you through September. In exchange, considering your cooking, if you're willing, and your opinion. I've got a drainage problem on the south pasture I haven't been able to figure out, and from what I can see, you've got a good head for land management." She stared at him. "You want my opinion on the drainage problem?" "Yes, you've been ranching 11 years. 11 years of ranching, and still a drainage problem on the south pasture, which suggests that 11 years hasn't solved it, and maybe another pair of eyes would help." Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'd want to see the south pasture before I offered any opinion." "That's reasonable," Elias said, "and the cooking arrangement would be 2 meals a week. Lunch on working days, my say on what's prepared. Your say entirely, and your men work to my direction on this property." "Not their own," he looked at her, agreed. She held out her hand. He shook it. That was how it started, with a fence post and a handshake and 2 people who were careful with what they trusted. The first Tuesday that Elias's ranch hands came to work, Mabel had already been up for 2 hours. She had a list organized by priority: the roof first, then the well, then the remaining fencing, and she gave each man a clear task and didn't ask twice whether they understood. The men, 2 brothers named Clement and Roy, who had worked for Elias for 3 years and had the easy, wordless efficiency of siblings who'd spent a lifetime working side by side, took their tasks without argument and got to work. Elias came with them. Mabel had not expected that. "Thought you'd be sending your men," she said when he swung down from Bishop at her gate. "My men are here," he said. "I'm here too. You don't have your own work?" "I'll get to it." He looked at the roof. "Where do you want me?" She put him on the roof, which was where the hardest work was, and which told her something about what kind of man he was when he started in without complaint. By noon, the east corner of the roof had been stripped and was being properly rebeamed. Mabel had lunch ready at the table outside, cornbread and salt pork and beans with a pot of strong coffee, and the four of them ate together in a working quiet that was easy and uncomplicated. Elias ate everything she put in front of him. He didn't make comments about the food except to say once, "That's the best cornbread I've had since I don't know when," which he said plainly, without embellishment, the way you said a simple true thing. Mabel said thank you and didn't make anything of it. After lunch, Elias walked with her down to the south pasture on his own property to look at the drainage problem. Mabel walked the perimeter of it twice, looked at the slope of the land, walked it once more, and then stood in the center of it with her hands on her hips. "You've got a hard clay pan about 18 inches down on the east side," she said. "Water comes in from the north slope, hits the pan, can't drain, spreads laterally instead. You're not going to solve it with surface drainage. You need a French drain on the east boundary, probably 60 feet, angled toward the low point at the property corner." Elias looked at her. "How do you know about clay pan?" "I grew up on clay pan land in Wyoming," she said. "Spent 8 years watching my father try to solve the same problem with surface work. Watched it fail every year." She paused. "A French drain's not complicated to install. Labor-intensive, but not complicated. I've been trying to figure that pasture out for 6 years," Elias said. "Then you've wasted 6 years on the wrong solution," she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. He looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't immediately identify, something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite admiration, but lived somewhere between the two. "I have," he said. "You're right." They walked back to her property in the late afternoon light. She told him she could draw up a simple plan for the French drain if he wanted it. He said he'd appreciate that. When Clement and Roy loaded their tools back into the wagon and headed back toward the Whitaker Ranch, Elias lingered for a moment at the gate. He looked at the work they'd done, the solid new roofing on the east corner, the tamped fence posts along the north line, the garden rows running straight and true in the late light. "You've built a lot in 3 weeks," he said. "Not enough," she said. "No," he agreed, "but a lot." He touched his hat. He went home. Mabel stood at her gate for a moment after Bishop's hoofbeats had faded. She was tired in the way that good hard work made you tired, which was a clean and decent feeling. She looked at her property, still ragged in a dozen places, still half-finished, in ways that would take months to resolve, and felt something that wasn't hope exactly, but was in the neighborhood of it. She went inside and got back to work. The second Tuesday was easier than the first. The third was easier than the second. By the fourth week, Mabel had established a rhythm with Elias's hands that functioned with the efficiency of a well-run operation. She kept the list. She tracked the materials. She managed the sequence of tasks with the same methodical intelligence she'd applied to everything since her arrival. And Clement and Roy, who were practical men, unbothered by working under a woman's direction, came and went without friction. Elias came with them every time. He did not explain this. He simply arrived, took whatever task needed doing, and worked. He was not the kind of man who required conversation to fill space. He didn't offer compliments or pleasant small talk, or any of the social lubricant that men sometimes used when they weren't quite sure what a woman expected of them. He worked, and he ate what she cooked, and sometimes in the evenings when the day's work was done and his hands had headed back, he would sit on her porch step with a cup of coffee, and they would talk. Not about anything that should have mattered. The state of the north fence. The drainage plan for the south pasture, which she had drawn up on brown paper in careful, clear lines. The weather patterns in Montana as compared to Wyoming. The particular stubbornness of hardpan soil, the price of seed. Whether the cloud formation building over the western ridge was going to deliver rain by Thursday. But Mabel noticed that the conversations lasted longer than they needed to. That neither of them was particularly eager to end them. She noticed this the way she noticed anything uncomfortable, with a clean, clear-eyed attention that didn't let her lie to herself about what she was seeing. She was not a woman who indulged in fantasies. She had too much experience with the cost of wanting things she wasn't allowed to have. One evening, near the end of the 5th week, She was carrying a basin of water back from the creek when she stopped at the sound of voices from the road. Calvin Roswell, and with him, Ida Pruitt and her husband Samuel, all three of them in a wagon headed back toward town. They had not seen Mabel yet. She was at the edge of her property, half hidden by the scrub. "Whitaker's been over there again," Calvin Roswell was saying. The particular satisfaction in his voice was the kind of satisfaction that came from believing you understood other people's motivations better than those people did. "Tuesday and Thursday both, near as I can tell." "What in the world is he doing?" Ida Pruitt said. "What do you think he's doing? Man's been alone long enough to get desperate." Calvin's voice dropped, but in the still evening air it carried. Of all the women he could spend time with, that woman. Ida Pruitt made a sound of delicate, practiced sympathy. "Well, perhaps he simply feels sorry for her. Pity or desperate," Calvin said. "Only two reasons a man like Whitaker would bother himself with a woman like that." Mabel stood very still until the wagon had moved on. She carried her basin back to the cabin. She put it down on the table. She stood in the middle of her floor for a moment, with her hands at her sides. She had known this was coming. She had known it from the first time Elias Whitaker sat on her porch step, and the conversation went longer than it needed to. She had known it the way she knew all the things she was not permitted to have, with the tired, familiar precision of long experience. Pity or desperate, she told herself it didn't matter what Calvin Roswell thought. But she also knew that Red Creek had already made up its mind about her. And a woman who had been carrying the weight of other people's contempt for her entire life knew exactly how that contempt could turn, how it could shift its aim, how it could extend from her to anyone who chose to stand near her. The next Tuesday, when Elias arrived with Clement and Roy, Mabel was civil and precise and directed the work with her usual efficiency. She cooked lunch. She discussed the drainage plan. She was everything she had learned to be when she was keeping herself contained. She said nothing about what she had heard on the road. And Elias, who was a perceptive man, looked at her across the table once, during lunch, with the quiet attention of someone who knew that something had shifted and chose not to press it. Not yet. It was in the 6th week that the thing happened which undid temporarily everything Mabel had been so carefully managing. She had been in the barn. She'd finally begun the work of stabilizing the foundation, which was slow and punishing labor when she heard hoofbeats on the road, and then voices. She came to the barn door and looked out. Elias was at her gate. And with him, from the direction of town, was a woman on a pale horse, a genuinely beautiful woman, small and fair-haired, with the kind of figure that a dress was designed to flatter. Mabel could not hear what was being said, but she could see the woman's face clearly in the afternoon light. She was laughing at something Elias had said. He was not laughing, but he was listening with a comfortable attention that told Mabel they knew each other. Mabel stood in the barn door and watched. The woman reached out and touched Elias's arm, just briefly the way women touched the arms of men they had a history with. He glanced down at her hand and then back up at her face. Mabel went back into the barn. She picked up the tamping bar and went back to the foundation work and focused exclusively on the task in front of her until the hoofbeats moved on, and then there was the sound of Elias at her gate. "That was Helen Caulfield," he said, when she came back to the barn door. "She runs the millinery in town with her sister." Mabel said nothing. "We were acquainted some years ago," he said, "before." She looked at him. "Before what?" "Before my wife died." He said it with the even flatness of a man who had said it many times and had worn the sharp edge off it through repetition. We were neighbors a long time ago. She moved to Red Creek about 2 years before I did." Mabel nodded once. "I see. She wanted to invite me to the harvest social next month," he said. "At the Grange Hall." She turned back to the foundation work. "That's got nothing to do with me," she said. "Mabel." She stopped. She didn't turn around. "Are you all right?" he said. The question was so direct and so quiet that it got inside her guard before she could stop it. She put the tamping bar against the foundation and breathed. She felt the answer pressing up from somewhere in her chest, the honest answer, the one she was not going to say, which was, "No, I'm not all right." I have spent my whole life being the woman that men are seen with because they feel sorry for her or because they're desperate, and I am so tired of being that woman that I could scream." What she said instead was, "I'm fine." She heard him step into the barn. She heard him cross the floor toward her. She braced herself. He stopped about 3 feet behind her. "I want to say something," he said. "You don't have to say anything, I want to." She turned then because she was not a coward even when she was afraid. She turned and looked at him, and the afternoon light was coming through the barn's broken board siding in long parallel lines across the dirt floor, and he was standing in it with his hat in his hand. He'd taken his hat off, which was such a particular and deliberate gesture that it caught her off guard. "I know what this town says about me being over here," he said. "I know what they say about you. I know what kind of man Calvin Roswell is, and I know how long he's had this town listening to his opinion." He looked at her directly, steadily, without any of the social flinching that men often did around women in difficult conversations. "None of that is what I'm doing here." Mabel kept her face still. "Then what are you doing here?" "I don't know yet," he said. "Not exactly, but it isn't pity, and it isn't desperation." He paused. "I know what both of those feel like. This isn't either one of them." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not pretty, Elias," she said. The words came out quiet and flat, the way words came out when you'd said them to yourself so many times they'd lost the power to hurt you, except they hadn't. Not entirely, because nothing ever lost its power entirely. "I know that. I've known it my whole life. I know what I look like, and I know what this town thinks, and I know." Mabel, his voice wasn't harsh. It wasn't even particularly sharp. But it stopped her. She went quiet. He looked at her across the barn in the long afternoon light with his hat still in his hand. "That's fine," he said. "I don't need fancy." He paused, just briefly. "I need honest. And you're the most honest person I've met in 11 years of knowing this valley." The silence after that was absolute. Mabel stood in it. She breathed. She felt something inside her, something she had walled off a very long time ago, and had not expected to feel again shift in the dark, like an animal that had been still for so long it had forgotten it was still alive. She did not allow herself to trust it. Not yet. She had been here before. Not exactly here, not with these exact words, but in the neighborhood of it, and she had learned what happened when she let herself believe in something she hadn't yet seen proven. But she did not run from it either. She looked at him, this big quiet man with his hat in his hand, and his honest face and 11 years of his own grief carved into the lines around his eyes, and she said the only true thing she had. "I'll need to see more than one afternoon in a barn before I believe that," she said. And Elias Whitaker, for the first time since they had met, smiled. It changed his whole face, made him look younger than 41, and more real, and something that Mabel could not name but felt in the center of her chest like a tuning fork struck against the right frequency. "Fair enough," he said. He put his hat back on. "I'll be here Thursday." He was, and the week after that, and the week after that. Thursday came, and Elias was at her gate before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. Mabel heard Bishop's hoofbeats from inside the cabin and felt something move in her chest that she immediately pressed back down. She was not going to become a woman who listened for a man's horse. She had survived too much to allow herself that particular vulnerability. She finished braiding her hair, pinned it back, and went outside with her work list already in her hand. Clement and Roy were with him. The three of them dismounted at the gate, and Elias looked at her across the yard with that same quiet attention he'd had since the first day, not expectant, not performing anything. Just present in the particular way of a man who had decided he was going to keep showing up and didn't need to make a production of it. "Morning," he said, and touched his hat. "Morning," she said. "The well needs the most attention today. I've got the tools laid out on the east side." "Then we'll start with the well." That was it. No reference to what had been said in the barn 2 days before. No careful hovering, no meaningful looks, no behavior designed to signal anything about where they stood. He picked up a shovel and went to work. Mabel stood for a half-second longer than she needed to, watching him go, and then she went to work too. The well took all of Thursday and most of the following Tuesday, which meant that for 2 full working days, Elias was down in a hole in the earth, while Mabel managed the rope and the pulley and the dirt removal above. And they communicated the way people communicated when one of them was 8 feet underground in short, functional sentences, questions and answers, the clean, efficient language of a task that required full attention. "How deep is this clay layer?" he called up. "Should break around 10 feet if it matches what I saw when I tried to dig last week," she called back. "Your hands doing all right up there?" "My hands have been doing all right for 28 years. A pause from below. "Then that's not what I asked." She looked down the shaft at the dim shape of him. "They're fine," she said. "Keep digging." She heard him laugh, a short, low sound, and the scraping of the shovel resumed. The well hit water at 11 feet, which was deeper than Mabel had hoped but shallower than she'd feared. When Elias came back up the rope hand over hand and stepped onto solid ground, he was filthy with clay and water and the particular dark grime of underground work. And he looked at her with something like satisfaction before he looked at anything else. 11 feet, he said. "I heard," she said. "You were right about the clay pan. Broke clean through about 10.5, I know." She handed him a cloth to wipe his face. I heard the change in the shovel sound. He took the cloth and stopped. Looked at her. "You were tracking the sound." "I was paying attention," she said, which was not the same thing as admitting she'd been listening for the particular moment when the work shifted in his favor. He wiped his face and said nothing more about it, but he was smiling when he handed the cloth back. It was Roy who told her, without meaning to, the thing that changed what she understood about Elias Whitaker. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks into their arrangement, and Clement and Roy were finishing the last of the east fencing, while Elias was inside the cabin repairing the window frame on the north wall. Mabel was outside at the garden, turning the soil between rows, close enough to the barn where Roy was gathering tools that she could hear him talking to his brother in the easy, unguarded way of men who thought they were alone. "Man's different over here," Roy was saying. "Different how?" Clement said. "I don't know, lighter." A pause, the sound of tools being shifted. "You remember what he was like that first winter after his daughter died? When he didn't speak 10 words in a week?" Clement made a sound of acknowledgement. "He's not like that anymore," Roy said. "Not when he's over here." Mabel kept turning the soil. She did not stop. She did not look toward the barn. She kept her face pointed at the ground and her hands moving steadily, and she absorbed what she had just heard the way she absorbed most difficult things quietly, completely, storing it somewhere interior where she could look at it more carefully later. His daughter. She had known about the wife. He had mentioned Clara briefly, in the early days of their arrangement, the way you mentioned a fact that was part of your history and needed to be stated once so it wasn't a secret. But he had not mentioned a daughter. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about what it cost a man to lose a child, and how it changed the architecture of a person from the inside, made certain rooms in them uninhabitable, made others into places they returned to alone at night when no one was watching. She thought about what Roy had said. Lighter. She was not going to let herself make too much of that. She had been the cause of things she hadn't meant to cause before, and she had learned the cost of it. But she held the word quietly in the back of her mind through the rest of the day's work, and she examined it carefully, and she found that she could not entirely dismiss it. That evening, when the work was done and Clement and Roy had gone, and Elias was sitting on her porch step with his coffee, Mabel said, without looking at him directly, "You never mentioned Rose." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. She felt him go still beside her, not tense still. The specific stillness of someone who had just heard something from the part of themselves they kept covered. "Roy," he said quietly. "He didn't mean to," she said. "He wasn't talking to me. He didn't know I could hear." Another silence, longer this time. "She was 3, Elias said." His voice was even, but she could hear what was underneath it. The evenness was the thing holding everything else back. "Fever that winter. I had the best doctor I could get from Billings and it didn't matter. Some things don't matter how much you want them to, or how hard you try." Mabel said nothing. She knew better than to fill the kind of silence that needed to be empty. "I don't say her name much," he said. Not because I've forgotten her. Because it's still, he stopped, because saying it still costs me something, and I don't always have enough left at the end of a day to afford that particular cost. Mabel looked at her coffee cup. I lost a child I wasn't supposed to have, she said quietly. Different from yours. The man who it was a different situation. But I understand something about that cost, she paused. I understand how a grief like that makes you put certain doors inside yourself and not open them again. He turned and looked at her. She kept her eyes on her coffee cup. She had not meant to say that. She was not accustomed to saying things like that. But the evenness of the night and the particular quality of his voice, when he had said Rose had opened something in her that she hadn't expected, and the words had come out before she could stop them. Mabel, he said. I don't need you to say anything about it, she said quickly. I didn't say it to ask for anything. I said it because I wanted you to know that I understood what you meant. A long pause. I know you didn't, he said. That's why it mattered. She looked up then. He was watching her with that direct, unhurried attention. And in the long evening light she could see clearly the lines around his eyes, and the gray at his temples, and the particular way grief sat in a face when it had been there long enough to become part of the architecture. She looked back at her coffee. You should go home, she said. You've got a long morning tomorrow. I do, he said. But he didn't move for another few minutes. They sat on her porch in the warm September evening while the light went purple and the first stars appeared, and neither of them said anything more. And it was the most honest conversation Mabel Hartwell had had with another human being in a very long time. The town noticed, of course it did. Small towns noticed everything, and Red Creek was the particular kind of small, where Calvin Roswell had made himself the central clearinghouse for information about other people's business. Within a week of the well being repaired, it was common knowledge in Red Creek that Elias Whitaker had been working the Hartwell property on Tuesdays and Thursdays both. Within 2 weeks, it was common knowledge that he'd been seen sitting on her porch in the evenings. Within 3 weeks, Calvin Roswell had developed a theory about it that he was sharing freely with anyone who would stand still long enough to listen. Mabel knew all of this because Henderson, the farm supply man, told her. He didn't want to. That was clear from the careful, apologetic way he approached it one afternoon when she came in for a spool of wire, turning a pencil in his hands and looking at the counter rather than her face. I want you to know it's not my business to say this, Henderson said. And I want you to know I don't agree with the man's thinking. Go ahead, Mabel said. Calvin Roswell's been saying that Whitaker's arrangement with you is that he's taking advantage. Not of you. He paused. Of the situation, that a man like Whitaker spending time with a woman like another pause, and this one clearly cost him. He's saying that a decent woman wouldn't have allowed the arrangement to go on as long as it has without formal courting or... Thank you, Mr. Henderson, Mabel said. Mabel, I understand what you're telling me. She put her money on the counter for the wire. I'm not surprised, and I appreciate that you told me rather than letting me find out from someone less kind. She picked up the wire and walked out. She stood outside for a moment in the September heat with the wire spool in both hands and the old familiar weight settling across her shoulders. Not quite shame, she had never permitted herself the full weight of shame because she had done nothing to deserve it, but the thing that lived next door to shame, the thing that was more about exhaustion than anything else. The exhaustion of being required to justify her own existence to people who had decided about her before they knew anything. A decent woman. She thought about that phrase all the way home. She thought about it while she fed the chickens she'd acquired 2 weeks earlier from a farm auction. She thought about it while she boiled water for coffee and stood at her window, looking at the property she had built with her own hands from a caved-in wreck into something that was, by any fair accounting, becoming a real working homestead. A decent woman, and then she thought, let them say what they want. She had spent her entire life being discussed by people who didn't know her. This was not new. The only question was whether she was going to allow it to change what she did. She decided she was not. The next Tuesday when Elias arrived, she told him what Henderson had said. She did not soften it. She was not a woman who softened things unnecessarily. She told him clearly and plainly what the town was saying, watching his face while she did it. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, his jaw was tight in a way she hadn't seen before. He looked at the gatepost she'd been leaning against, then back at her. "Calvin Roswell," he said, "that seems to be the primary source. That man has made a career of other people's business." He said it with a quiet force that was more controlled than anger. "He's had it in for you since before you finished unpacking." "He's had it in for me since he saw me walk off the freight wagon," Mabel said. "That's nothing new. It's not going to be nothing new when it starts affecting your credit line and your access to suppliers," Elias said. "Which is what it becomes when Roswell decides to make it a campaign rather than an opinion." She looked at him sharply. "You think it'll get that far?" "I know Calvin Roswell," he said. "Yes, I think it'll get that far if he decides to push it." He paused. "I've been thinking about this, about the arrangement we have, about how it looks." Something cold moved through Mabel's chest. She recognized the shape of this conversation. She had been in the neighborhood of it before, not exactly this street, not exactly this house, but the neighborhood, and she knew what direction it generally moved. "If you're thinking of ending the arrangement," she said, and her voice came out flat and steady and entirely under her control, "you should do that. I've told you from the start that I don't need—" "I'm not thinking of ending the arrangement," he said. She stopped. "I'm thinking about what it means that I don't want to end it," he said. "And what I'm prepared to do about that." He looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention she'd come to know well enough that she could read the variations in it. This one was not casual. This one had something underneath it that was working its way toward the surface. "Elias," she said carefully. "I'm not going to say something you're not ready to hear," he said. "I know you're not. I know you well enough by now to know that." He looked away for a moment, toward the south, toward the edge of his own property. "I'm just saying that what Roswell thinks about our arrangement and what I think about it are very different things. And I'm not inclined to let his version stand unchallenged much longer." She was quiet. Inside her chest, something was doing something she didn't entirely have words for. It was not quite hope. It was more alert than hope, more cautious, more like the thing that came just before hope when you'd been wrong before and couldn't afford to be wrong again. "One thing at a time," she said. "All right," he said. "The barn foundation," she said. "That's one thing." He picked up a shovel, lead the way. The harvest social at the Grange Hall was on the second Saturday of October, and Mabel did not go. She had not been invited, not officially, and she had no interest in standing at the edges of Red Creek's social world, feeling the temperature of rooms that didn't particularly want her in them. She knew Elias went. She knew because Clement mentioned it in passing. Not carefully, not unkindly, just as a fact, mister. "Whitaker's got the social tonight, so we'll be heading back before dark," and Mabel nodded and said that was fine and went about the rest of the afternoon's work with the same methodical attention she gave everything. She did not think about Helen Cofield's hand on Elias's arm. She did not think about it with such consistent, deliberate effort that it became exhausting by early evening. And she finally sat down on her porch step and admitted to herself that she was thinking about it constantly and had been since the words left Clement's mouth. This was the thing she had been most careful to avoid, and here she was neck-deep in it anyway. She had let herself get used to him, used to his presence and his voice and his particular way of listening, the way he heard what she said, and then took an actual moment to consider it rather than just formulating his response. She had let herself get used to the evenings on the porch, and the working silences, and the way he said her name with a kind of weight that made her feel like the name belonged to someone worth the gravity of it. She had let herself get used to it, and now she was sitting on her porch on a Saturday night listening to the darkness and thinking about him at a Grange Hall in a clean shirt while Helen Caulfield stood nearby, looking exactly the way a woman was supposed to look. She was still sitting there later, much later, when the night had gone fully dark and cold when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She didn't move. She sat and she listened, and the hoofbeats slowed and stopped at her gate. And then there was the sound of Elias Whitaker dismounting in the dark. Social end early, she said without getting up. I left early. He came to the gate but didn't come through it. She could see him in the dark, just the shape of him, the hat the set of his shoulders. I didn't want to be there, why not? He was quiet for a moment. Because I kept thinking about what you were doing over here, he said. And everything that was at the social seemed a great deal less important than finding out. Mabel breathed, slow and careful. I was sitting on the porch, she said. I see that thinking, she said. About what? She looked at him across the gate in the dark. She thought about lying, about saying something neutral and practical and self-protective. She was very good at that. She had been doing it her whole life. About you, she said, at the social. The silence after that was absolute and long enough that she felt the cold all the way through. Then Elias opened the gate. He came and sat on the porch step beside her, not close enough to be presumptuous, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold autumn night. He didn't say anything for a minute. They both looked at the dark yard. Helen Caulfield is a lovely woman, he said. I know, Mabel said. She asked me to dance twice, he said. Mabel kept her face very still. And both times, Elias said, all I could think was that I was at the wrong place entirely. He looked at her sideways in that quiet way. That I'd rather be sitting on a cold porch in the dark, with the most honest woman I know, than dancing with someone I've got no honest feeling for. The night made a sound around them, whined in the grass, something moving in the scrub at the property's edge. Mabel said, you can't just say things like that. Why not? Because I don't know what to do with them, she said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended, carrying something she hadn't quite meant to let through. Because I spent 28 years learning not to trust that kind of thing, and you keep saying it, and I don't. Mabel, I'm not built for it, she said, flat and final, the old defensive line. I'm not the kind of woman that things like this happen to. I know that. Stop, he said. She stopped. He turned on the step so he was facing her more directly, and his voice when he spoke was quiet and completely level, the way it was when he said something he had thought about carefully. I don't know what happened to you, he said, the whole of it. I know pieces, and I'm not asking you to tell me more than you want to tell me. But I need you to hear this. He paused. You have been telling yourself a story about what kind of woman you are since before I met you. I can hear it in how you talk about yourself, and that story is wrong. She felt the words land in her chest like stones dropped into deep water, sending rings outward in every direction. You don't know that, she said. I know you, he said. Well enough. He looked at her steadily, and I think you know me well enough to know that I don't say things I don't mean. She did know that. That was precisely the problem. She looked at him in the dark, this man who had shown up to her gate with a shovel, and no ulterior motive she had been able to find in 6 weeks of careful, determined looking, and felt something inside her do something she could not stop. Something like a door opening, very slowly, very cautiously. But opening. You should probably go home, she said. I probably should, he agreed. Neither of them moved for another minute. Then he stood, touched his hat, and went back through the gate. She heard Bishop's hoofbeats moving away into the dark, and she sat on her porch alone, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum where the door was opening, and she thought, Lord, what have I done? What she had done, it turned out, was allow herself to be known. And the thing about being known, truly known, past the surface, past the size, and the plain face and the worn teeth, was that it was the most terrifying thing she had ever permitted. More terrifying than the caved-in roof, more terrifying than the dry well. More terrifying than Calvin Roswell and Ida Pruitt, and the rotten tomato on her back and every other cruelty Red Creek had directed at her since the day she stepped off the freight wagon. Because the roof couldn't break her heart if it fell again. Calvin Roswell couldn't break what she'd already walled off. But this man, this quiet, honest, grief-carrying man who showed up to her gate every Tuesday and Thursday and sat on her porch in the dark and said things he meant, this man had gotten inside the walls somehow. Not by force, not by charm, by consistency, by showing up when he said he would and doing what he said he'd do and treating her intelligence and her judgment like things that deserved respect rather than tolerance. By seeing her, she had not been prepared for being seen. Not at 28 years old in a half-repaired cabin in Red Creek, Montana. Not by anyone. The following Tuesday, she was at the north fence when he arrived, and she heard his voice before she heard his footsteps. Mabel, she turned. He was standing 10 feet away with something in his hand. A small bundle of late-season wildflowers, the scrubby, tough-stemmed kind that grew along the road in October, yellow and white and barely hanging on against the coming cold. He was holding them with the particular awkwardness of a man who was doing something that didn't come naturally to him anymore, but had decided to do it anyway. She stared at them. "I know they're not much," he said, and there was the faintest unsteadiness in his voice, the first unsteadiness she'd ever heard from him. I know it's a small thing. But I wanted to bring you something that wasn't a tool or a suggestion about your drainage situation." Mabel looked at the flowers. She looked at his face. She looked at his hands, those big, work-ruined hands, holding a bunch of October wildflowers, with the careful grip of a man holding something he was afraid of getting wrong. She felt the door open another inch. She walked toward him and took the flowers from his hands. "Thank you," she said. He exhaled. Actually exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath. "You're welcome," he said. She looked down at the flowers. Yellow and white against her palm, barely hanging on. "They're exactly right," she said quietly. And she went back to the fence work, carrying them in one hand while she worked, and Elias Whitaker watched her for a moment longer than he needed to, before he picked up his own tools and followed. The thing that nearly unraveled all of it came from a direction Mabel had not anticipated. She had been anticipating Calvin Roswell. She had been anticipating the town's judgment and the social pressure and the particular cruelties that small places delivered to women who didn't fit the shape they were supposed to fill. She was braced for all of that. She was not braced for Elias's pass to walk through her gate on a Wednesday afternoon. She was alone. Elias's hands didn't come Wednesdays, and Elias himself had business in town when a wagon pulled up to her property and a woman climbed down. An older woman, well-dressed, with the straight-backed bearing of old money and the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to assessing things and finding them wanting. She introduced herself as Margaret Whitaker, Elias's mother. Mabel had not known his mother was in the territory. She had apparently arrived from Bozeman 3 days earlier to visit her son, had heard the talk in town about his arrangement with the Hartwell woman, and had come to form her own opinion. Mabel invited her inside. She set out coffee. She was civil and precise and gave nothing away. Margaret Whitaker drank her coffee and looked around the cabin at the repaired walls, the solid roof, the neat rows of supplies on the shelves, and she said, in the direct way of a woman who had not gotten old by pretending, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Mabel said. "Something predatory. The town paints a particular picture." "The town has very little to do with what happens on this property," Mabel said. Margaret looked at her over the coffee cup. "My son hasn't spoken about a woman with any particular feeling since Clara died," she said. "He doesn't speak about you with feeling exactly, but when I mention your name, there's a..." She paused, choosing the word carefully. "A quality of attention that I recognize." Mabel set her cup down. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, "I don't know what you're asking me." "I'm asking what your intentions are toward my son," the older woman said. The directness of it startled a short laugh out of Mabel before she could stop it. Margaret Whitaker's eyebrow went up. "I'm sorry," Mabel said. "I didn't expect that question to be directed at me." "Why not?" "Because in my experience," Mabel said carefully, "that question is directed at the man." "In your experience," Margaret said, "and in mine. But Elias has never been the kind of man who needed his mother managing his intentions." "You, I don't know yet." Mabel looked at this woman, the sharp eyes, the straight back, the coffee cup held with the particular confidence of someone who had raised difficult children and survived difficult things, and she made a decision. "I don't have intentions," she said. "I have a working arrangement that has become something I value. I have a friendship, for lack of a better word, with a man I respect. I have not allowed myself to think past that because I have spent my whole life being the woman that men feel sorry for or use as a temporary arrangement, and I will not permit myself to become that again." Margaret Whittaker was quiet for a moment, and if it's not that, she said. Then I'll believe it when I've seen enough proof to earn belief, Mabel said. Which takes longer for some of us than others. Another silence. And then Margaret Whittaker set down her coffee cup and said something Mabel had not expected. Good, she said. He needs someone who won't take him at face value and let him disappear back inside himself. He's been doing that for 7 years. He's very good at it. She stood. You seem like someone who doesn't let people hide. Mabel said nothing. I'll see myself out, Margaret said. She paused at the door, looked back. The drainage solution on the south pasture was correct, by the way. He told me about it. He's impressed, though he'd call it something more restrained if you asked him. She left. Mabel sat at her table for a long time after the wagon had gone. She thought about 7 years of a man disappearing inside himself. She thought about the particular way grief remade the architecture of a person and how long it took to find the doors again. She thought about a big, quiet man with late-season wildflowers in his work-ruined hands and an exhale of relief when she took them. She put her hand flat on the table and looked at it. Her own hand, wide and calloused and strong, she thought, he sees it. He actually sees it. And then she thought, what do you do when someone sees you? She didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in 28 years, she was willing to wait and find out. The first frost came early that year, and with it came the particular kind of cold that settled into everything: the ground, the walls, the spaces between people who hadn't yet said the things they needed to say. Mabel noticed it the Tuesday after Margaret Whittaker's visit. Not in the weather, in Elias. He was present the way he always was, on time, working hard, no complaint about anything, but there was something underneath the surface of him that was different. Attention she hadn't seen before, running through the set of his shoulders and the way he held his jaw when he thought she wasn't looking. She watched him through the morning without saying anything, the way she watched most things, carefully, quietly, storing what she saw for later consideration. At lunch he ate without his usual attention to the food. Your mother came to see me, she said. He set down his fork. Slowly. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a door to open and was now working out how to walk through it. I know, he said. She didn't tell you beforehand. No, she told me after. He picked up his coffee, held it. I owe you an apology for that. She had no right to come here without telling me first. She had every right, Mabel said. She's your mother and she was concerned. She was managing, he said. There's a difference. She was honest, Mabel said, which is more than most people are. I didn't mind it. She looked at him. What I minded was finding out that the whole town has been talking about us to the point that it reached your mother in Bozeman before she'd even arrived. The muscle in his jaw moved. Red Creek has a long reach when it wants to. Calvin Roswell has a long reach, she said. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It's not. She waited. He set down the coffee cup and looked at her directly, that full, unhurried attention she had come to trust more than almost anything else she knew about him. I'm going to say something, he said. Say it. I've been thinking about what my mother said to me when she got back from here. She said. He paused, working out the words. She said, you were the first person she'd met in 7 years who talked about me like I was worth taking seriously. He stopped again. That made me realize I'd been letting this town set the terms for something that's nobody's business but ours. Mabel held very still. And I'm done letting them do that, he said. Elias, I'm not saying this to put pressure on you, he said. I know where you are. I know it takes time, and I know I haven't earned the full weight of your trust yet, and I'm not asking for it today. He looked at her steadily. I'm saying that whatever this is between us, whatever it's becoming, it deserves to be treated like it's real. Not like a rumor, not like a scandal, like something real. The silence was long and full and complicated. What are you proposing? She said carefully. I'm proposing that I stop coming here only on Tuesdays and Thursdays, he said. That I come to town with you when you have business there. That I stop pretending to Red Creek that this is strictly a working arrangement when it hasn't been strictly a working arrangement for about 4 weeks now. Mabel breathed. She thought about Calvin Roswell, about Ida Pruitt. about the freight wagon and the rotten tomato and the 19 days it had taken for the town to make up its mind. She thought about what happened to women like her when they claimed things they weren't supposed to have, how the cruelty got sharper, how the contempt got louder, how people who had been quietly unkind became actively so. She thought about the October wildflowers. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right," she said again, more firmly. "But on my terms. Name them. I don't want to be escorted anywhere like I need protecting. If we go to town together, we go because we have business and we go as equals." "Agreed. I won't have you managing people's opinions of me." "That's not your job and I won't have it." "Agreed." "And if this goes wrong," she stopped, started again. "If at any point this stops being real and becomes something else, something out of guilt or obligation, or the particular kind of loneliness that makes a man think he feels more than he does, you tell me. Directly, and I'll go back to running this property alone without a word of complaint." He looked at her for a long, steady moment. "I will tell you," he said. "Directly. That's a promise I can keep," she nodded. "Good," she said, and picked up her fork. "Then finish your lunch." They went to town together for the first time on a Friday morning in late October, and Mabel felt the shift in the air the moment Bishop and her borrowed mare turned onto the main road of Red Creek. She felt it in her spine first, then she heard it, the particular quality of sound that a town makes when it goes slightly too quiet in the wrong way. The conversations that paused a half-second too long. The heads that turned with just a fraction too much interest. She kept her eyes forward and her chin level. Beside her, Elias rode with the easy, unhurried posture of a man who did not acknowledge that anything unusual was happening, which was its own kind of statement, deliberate and clear. Their first stop was Henderson's for seed for the spring planting. Henderson was warm and professional, the same as always, and if he noticed the shift in their arrangement, he gave no visible sign of it. They conducted their business, Mabel and Elias both, and went back to the horses. The second stop was the feed merchant 2 buildings down, where Elias had a standing order he needed to adjust. They were coming back out when Calvin Roswell appeared on the boardwalk. He had not been there when they went in. He was there when they came out, and Mabel knew with the clear, cold certainty of long experience that this was not accidental. He was dressed in his merchant's best, silver-haired and well-composed. With 2 other men flanking him, Samuel Pruitt, and a larger man whose name Mabel didn't know, but whose face she recognized from the crowd outside the general store on the day of the tomato. Calvin looked at them. He let the look run from Elias to Mabel and back again, slow and deliberate, the way you looked at something you had already judged. "Whitaker," he said. "Didn't expect to see you on this end of town today." "Business, same as anyone," Elias said. "Business." Calvin let the word sit for a moment. His eyes moved to Mabel with the particular coldness of a man who had decided she was beneath direct address. "Getting a little irregular, isn't it? Your business arrangements." Elias's voice came out level. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Calvin said. He smiled, and the smile was the kind that didn't involve the eyes. "This town has certain standards, Whitaker. Standards that have kept it decent. Standards that." His gaze moved to Mabel again, settling, deliberate. "Not everyone who comes through here understands or appreciates." Mabel felt herself go very still. This was the moment. She had known it was coming, and now it was here, and what happened in the next 60 seconds was going to echo forward in ways she could not fully predict. She watched Elias. He was quiet for 2 full seconds. And then something happened that she had not expected, had not predicted, had not let herself believe would happen even in the most private corner of her mind, where she kept the things she was too afraid to want. He stepped forward, not toward Calvin, not aggressively. He simply moved 1 step, just one, so that he was standing level with Mabel rather than slightly ahead of her. So that when Calvin Roswell looked at them, he was looking at them together, both of them in the same line, the same plane. "The standard I care about," Elias said, "is the one where a person is judged by what they do and who they are. Mabel Hartwell has built more with her hands in 4 months than most people in this town have built in 4 years. He looked at Calvin with the level, specific attention of a man who has made a decision he is at peace with. That's the standard I'll be holding to. Calvin's eyes went narrow. Whitaker, I'm done with this conversation, Elias said. Not loudly, just finally. He touched the brim of his hat to Calvin, a purely formal acknowledgement that contained no warmth whatsoever, and then turned to Mabel and said quietly, "You have anything else on your list today?" She looked at him. Her chest was doing something complicated that she refused to show on her face. Henderson mentioned a seedling press, she said. I'd like to look at it. Then let's go look at it, he said. They walked past Calvin Roswell together. She felt his eyes on her back the whole length of the boardwalk. She did not turn around. What happened next happened fast, the way things did in small towns when a man like Calvin Roswell decided he'd been publicly disrespected. By Saturday morning, there was a story circulating in Red Creek that Mabel Hartwell had manufactured the arrangement with Elias Whitaker from the start, had engineered the situation on the abandoned property to draw in a wealthy rancher, because no man in his right state of mind would have chosen her otherwise. The story had Calvin's fingerprints all over it, in the particular way of things he set in motion, without saying directly. He didn't say Mabel was dishonest. He simply asked questions, in public, with that smooth merchant's voice. Wasn't it interesting that she'd bought that specific property? Wasn't it interesting that she'd started her repairs right on the boundary line nearest Whitaker's land? Wasn't it interesting how quickly a working arrangement had become something else? The questions were enough. They always were. Mabel heard about it from Henderson again on Monday morning, and this time Henderson looked older and more tired delivering it than he had the last time. I'm sorry, he said. I want you to know I said something to the men he was talking to. For what it's worth something, she said. Thank you. She walked home with her jaw tight and her mind working fast, the way it always worked when she was managing something difficult, not panicking, not spiraling. Just rapidly and methodically assessing the shape of the problem and what she had available to address it. The thing about Calvin Roswell's campaign was that it was designed to make her look calculating, to retroactively assign motive to everything she had done since arriving in Red Creek and reframe it as manipulation. It was sophisticated cruelty, the kind that was harder to answer than the rotten tomato, because it didn't have a face you could look at. It lived in the spaces between conversations, in the questions people asked and the ones they didn't. She thought about what it would do to Elias. Not to her, she had been managing other people's narratives about her since childhood and knew how to survive it. But to him, a man who had spent 7 years rebuilding his reputation after grief had hollowed him out. A man who had his mother's respect, his hands' loyalty, this valley's trust. A man who had stepped forward on a boardwalk and stood beside her in front of Calvin Roswell and every watching eye on that street. She thought about what Roswell's story would do to that. She was still thinking about it when Elias arrived Tuesday morning, and she could see immediately from the quality of his stillness that he had already heard. She did not wait for him to bring it up. You've heard what he's saying, she said. I've heard. He was watching her with that careful attention. How are you? I'm fine, she said. I'm worried about you. Something shifted in his face. You're worried about me. You have more to lose than I do in this town, she said plainly. You have land credit relationships that go back 11 years. I have, she gestured at her property with one hand, this, which I built alone and will keep regardless of what Calvin Roswell says. But if his story takes root and damages your standing with the merchants, with the bank, with anyone who... Mabel, he said her name with a quiet firmness that stopped her. She stopped. Do you believe what he's saying? He asked. About you, she stared at him. Of course I don't. Then neither do I, he said. And neither does anyone who's watched you work this property for 4 months. He held her gaze. I'm not going to let that man's story change what I know to be true. She felt the words land, absorbed them. Even if it cost you something, she said. The things worth having always cost something, he said. I figured that out a long time ago. I just spent 7 years being too afraid to let anything cost me anything again. She looked at him. Then she said, we should get to work. The south barn wall isn't going to fix itself. He picked up his hammer. But something between them had shifted again, gone deeper, taken on a new weight, the particular weight of two people who had stopped pretending that what they had was only about fence posts and drainage plans. It was Ida Pruitt who delivered the blow that neither of them had seen coming. 3 days after the story started circulating, Ida Pruitt came to Mabel's property alone on foot, at mid-morning, a deliberate choice of time. Mabel understood that ensured Elias would not be there. She came to the gate and stood there until Mabel came out of the barn. She was wearing her good dress. She had brought a covered dish, which she held in front of her like a shield. "I brought a pie," she said. Mabel looked at the covered dish. "I see that," she said. "Apple," Ida said. "I wanted to. I thought it would be civil to come," and she stopped. Started again. "I want to say something that Calvin doesn't know I'm saying." Mabel leaned against the barn door and waited. Ida Pruitt took a breath. "Elias Whitaker was engaged before he married Clara," she said. "To a woman named Frances Aldercott. She was from Bozeman. Beautiful girl, well-connected family." She paused. "She broke it off when he lost the eastern pasture in a bad season, said she wasn't prepared to marry a man who couldn't keep his land profitable." Another pause. "Elias never spoke about it publicly, but everyone knew. And Calvin knows." Mabel kept her face very still. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Calvin is planning to go to Frances Aldercott," Ida said. "He knows she's been widowed. Her husband died last year. Calvin is going to write to her and suggest that she come to Red Creek, suggest that Elias is that a man of his standing is being taken advantage of by someone who she stopped." Her face had gone pink with what looked like genuine distress. "I don't agree with it. I want you to know that I don't agree with it." "Do you disagree with it enough to tell him to stop?" Mabel said. Ida went quiet. "No," Mabel said. "I didn't think so." She looked at the woman across the gate. "You came here so you could tell yourself you warned me." "That's decent of you, Ida." "It is. But warning me isn't the same as stopping him." "I can't stop Calvin when he's decided something," Ida said. "No," Mabel said. "I imagine most people in this town feel exactly the same way." She took the pie. She was not going to be rude about a pie that hadn't done anything wrong, and she thanked Ida briefly and went back inside. She sat down at her table. Frances Aldercott, beautiful, well-connected, widowed. The woman who had walked away from Elias when things got difficult. The woman Calvin was going to dangle in front of this town like a mirror. Look what he could have had. Look what he has instead. Mabel pressed her hands flat on the table. She thought about it, with the methodical honesty she gave everything, and she arrived at the thing she had been trying not to arrive at for weeks, which was this: she was falling in love with Elias Whitaker. She had been falling for some time, and she was now facing the very real possibility that the town of Red Creek was going to pull out every weapon available to make sure it went wrong. Not because they hated her, exactly, because they had decided what she was before they knew her. And the story of what she was could not survive the story of what she and Elias were becoming. One of those stories had to be wrong, and small towns protected their existing stories with a particular ferocity. She stayed very still for a long time, then she got up and went back to work. She was not going to let Calvin Roswell make her decisions. She was not going to collapse. She was not going to protect herself by pulling away from Elias before she had to, because she had spent her whole life pulling away from things before she had to, and it had never saved her from anything except the things she actually wanted. She picked up her tools. She kept working. What she had not planned for, what no amount of methodical preparation could have prepared her for, was the confrontation outside the general store. It happened on a Thursday. Market day again. She was there with Elias. They had come together, as they had twice in the past 2 weeks, conducting their business with the same straightforward practicality they brought to everything. They were coming out of the general store when Calvin Roswell appeared, and this time he had not come alone. He had Samuel Pruitt and 3 other men from the Merchant Association. He had Ida, who stood slightly to one side with the expression of a woman who knew this was going to go badly and had come anyway. He had, standing at the edge of the gathering with a face Mabel did not recognize, a woman. Small, fair-haired, dressed well, Older than she had been when Elias knew her, they all were but recognizable in the particular way of women whose beauty had been their calling card. Frances Aldicott. He had actually done it. Mabel felt the blood leave her face. She felt Elias go completely dangerously still beside her. Calvin stepped forward with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had choreographed this. "Whitaker," he said, "glad we ran into you. Mrs. Aldicott arrived this morning. She came all this way on hearing that you were in, shall we say, somewhat confused circumstances." His eyes moved to Mabel with that long, cold calculation. "I thought you'd want the opportunity to compare your options in good daylight." The street had gone quiet in that particular way, everyone watching. No one intervening. Elias looked at Frances Aldicott. She was looking at him with an expression that mixed old hurt with something that might have been genuine apology. She had not, perhaps, fully understood what Calvin was setting her up to do. Elias looked back at Calvin. "What?" he said, very quietly. "Do you think you're doing?" "Just providing some perspective," Calvin said. "A man in your position, with your land and your reputation, shouldn't have to compromise because—" "Stop." Elias's voice was still quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that had something very large underneath it. Calvin did not stop, because a woman in reduced circumstances with no connections and that was the moment where the whole long-accumulated weight of weeks and months bore down, and Mabel watched Elias's face, and she saw the thing she had been afraid to look for. She saw him hesitate. It was brief, less than 2 seconds. But she had spent 4 months learning to read the specific language of this man's face, and she saw it, the flicker, the old fear, the 7 years of grief and isolation, and the paralyzing terror of being seen to make the wrong choice in public, of repeating the pattern that had cost him everything once before. She saw it, and then she watched him open his mouth. And the words that came out were not the words she needed. "This isn't what Mabel and I have is a practical arrangement," he said. "We've been neighbors helping each other through a difficult season. That's all it's ever been." The world went very quiet. Mabel heard it from inside a place that was suddenly very far away and very cold. She heard every word with perfect clarity, a practical arrangement. That's all it's ever been. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Calvin Roswell, and his jaw was tight, and she could see the exact moment he realized what he'd done. It moved across his face like weather, sudden and undeniable. He turned to her. "Mabel, excuse me," she said. Her voice came out entirely level. "That was the thing about having spent your whole life managing other people's cruelty. You got very good at keeping your voice level when everything inside you was coming apart." She picked up the package she'd come for. She walked past Calvin Roswell and Samuel Pruitt and Ida with her careful expression of misery. She walked past Frances Aldicott, who had the grace to look like she wished she were somewhere else entirely. She walked to her horse and she rode home. She did not cry on the road. She had made that mistake before. Let people see it, let them know they'd gotten through. She saved it until she was through her gate, and then the shaking started in her hands, and she let it, because there was no one to see. She had known. She had told herself from the beginning. She had said it clearly, both to herself and to him. "I don't know what to do with things like that. I'm not built for it. I don't have the capacity to survive being wrong about this." She had said all of it, and then she had let herself believe anyway. She sat on her porch floor, not the step, the floor, because her legs had stopped working correctly, and she pressed her back against the cabin wall she had repaired with her own hands. "A practical arrangement," she heard his voice say it. She heard the tone of it, defensive and retreating and afraid. She heard the word practical, which was the word men used when they needed something to be smaller and less dangerous than it actually was. 4 months. She had given 4 months of her careful, damaged, armor-plated trust to this man. She had let him see her. She had let herself be known. And when it counted, when the weight of the town and the pressure of public judgment bore down on him, he had made her small. He had made her a practical arrangement. She stayed on the floor until the shaking stopped. Then she stood. She went inside. She looked at her list, the list she had been keeping since the first day on this property, the list of every task that needed doing, and she picked up a pen and she added 3 new items. Replace the east barn post, winterize the well casing. Restock the wood supply before November. She was not going to stop. She was not going to collapse. She was not going to let Elias Whitaker or Calvin Roswell or the whole of Red Creek take from her the only thing that had never failed her, which was the ability to keep working when everything else fell apart. But she was also not going to open the gate when she heard Bishop's hoofbeats on the road 2 hours later. She heard him ride up. She heard him stop. She heard him dismount. She did not go to the window, Mabel. His voice through the door was rough in a way she had never heard from him before. Not even when he talked about Rose. I know you're in there. I know you can hear me. She said nothing. What I said paused and she could hear him working on it. What I said was wrong. It was wrong, and I knew it was wrong before I finished saying it. And there's nothing I can tell you that makes it less wrong. She pressed her back against the inside wall. I was afraid, he said. That's the only true thing I can give you. I was afraid, and I chose what the town expected instead of what was real. And I have done that before. I have made that exact mistake before, and I swore I never would again, and I did it anyway. His voice broke. Just slightly, just at the edges. Mabel, please. She stood against the wall. She heard him breathing on the other side of the door. She thought about the wildflowers. She thought about the coffee in the dark. She thought about Roy saying lighter and Margaret Whitaker saying you were the first person who talked about him like he was worth taking seriously. She thought about 2 seconds of hesitation and the word practical. Go home, Elias, she said. Her voice came out steady. Mabel, I heard what you said, she said through the door. In front of those people. In front of her. She stopped because the steadiness was costing her. I gave you something I don't give easily, and you made it small to protect yourself. I understand why, I do. But understanding why doesn't change what it felt like standing there on that street. Silence. Don't come back on Tuesday, she said. Another silence. Longer, right, he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. All right. She heard him walk back to Bishop. She heard him mount. She heard the hoofbeats go slowly down the road. And Mabel Hartwell stood against the wall of her cabin in the October cold and felt the door she had opened, for the first time in 28 years, swing quietly, heavily shut. The first Tuesday without Elias was the longest day Mabel had spent on the property since the very beginning. She was up before dawn, same as always. She had her list. She had her tools. She had the east barn post to replace, and the well casing to winterize, and the wood supply to build up before November came in hard. She had everything she needed to fill a day with work, and she filled it methodically, efficiently, without a single wasted motion. But the silence was different. She had grown accustomed, without fully realizing it, to the specific quality of sound that came with Elias being somewhere on the property. The weight of another person's presence, not conversation, not even proximity necessarily, just the knowledge that someone was there, working the same land, breathing the same cold October air. She had not understood how much she had come to rely on that quality of sound until it was absent. She replaced the east barn post. She mixed the winterizing compound for the well casing and applied it in careful, even coats. She split wood until her shoulders ached, and her hands were solid with the repetition of it. And she stacked it against the cabin wall in precise rows because she was a woman who did things precisely even when precision was the only control she had left. She did not look at the road. Or rather, she did not allow herself to look at the road more than she could help, which meant she looked at it less than a dozen times in the first day, which was a personal victory she was not going to examine too closely. By the end of the week, she had completed everything on her list and added 6 new items and completed 4 of those. The property was in better shape than it had ever been. The cabin was tight against the coming winter. The barn was solid. The garden rows were put to bed properly, covered and protected. She was building something real. She had always been building something real. That had not changed, But at night, when the work was done and the fire was banked and there was nothing left to occupy her hands, the silence in the cabin had a particular quality she did not like. It was the silence of a person who had let someone in and then lost them, which was a different and much heavier silence than the silence of a person who had been alone by choice. She had known better. She had told herself she knew better. She had built walls specifically designed to prevent this exact outcome, and the walls had failed, and she was sitting in the wreckage of them, with her list and her work and her determination to keep going. And underneath all of it was a grief she refused to name. She named it anyway in the dark, when there was no one to see. She missed him. She missed the coffee on the porch. She missed the working silences. She missed the particular way he said her name with that weight in it, like it belonged to someone worth the gravity. She missed the October wildflowers and the exhale of relief when she took them, and the smile that changed his whole face. She missed being seen, and she was furious with herself for it. Henderson came to see her on the 9th day. He didn't have a reason framed as a reason. He said he was checking whether she needed seat adjustments for the spring order, which was true enough to function as a pretext, but too early in the season to be urgent, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. She let him in and gave him coffee and waited. He drank half of it before he said Whitaker hasn't been to the Merchant Association meeting since the incident outside the general store. That's his business, she said. He resigned from the organizing committee, Henderson said. Effective immediately, he sent a letter. Calvin Roswell read it out loud at the meeting. I think he expected it to make Whitaker look unstable. It didn't. He paused, turning his cup. The letter said that he could not in good conscience continue to participate in a community body that allowed one of its prominent members to use it as an instrument of personal cruelty. Those were his words, instrument of personal cruelty. Mabel kept her face still. He named Calvin by name, Henderson said. In the letter, he laid out what had been done, the campaign against you, the questions planted in conversations, the Francis Aldercott business. All of it named and documented. He looked at her. Some of the men at the meeting didn't like hearing it. But some of them did. More than Calvin would have expected, I think. She looked at her coffee. What happened to Francis Aldercott? She asked. She went back to Bozeman the next morning, Henderson said. She came to speak to me before she left, which surprised me. She said she hadn't understood what Roswell was doing until she was already standing on that street, and that she was ashamed to have been part of it. Mabel absorbed that. She also said, Henderson continued carefully, that Elias Whitaker looked at you when you walked away from that street with an expression she recognized. She said she knew that expression because she'd spent years not earning it, and she knew what it cost a man to feel it. The silence in the cabin was absolute. Mabel set down her cup. She stood up and went to the window and looked at her property, the tight cabin, the solid barn, the stacked wood, the garden under its careful winter cover. Everything she had built, everything that had not failed her. He made me small, she said, in front of all of them. He did, Henderson said, and he knows it. And from what I can tell, he has not given himself a moment's peace about it since. She turned. That doesn't change what happened. No, Henderson said. It doesn't. I'm not saying it does. He stood, putting his hat back on. I'm just saying that a man who resigns from a committee and names names in a letter, and doesn't eat properly, and doesn't sleep enough, and rides past the east boundary of his property every single morning looking at your gate. He paused. That man is not a man who thinks what he did was acceptable. That's a man in the specific hell of knowing exactly what he cost himself by being a coward at the wrong moment. He touched his hat and went to the door. I'll adjust the spring seed order, he said. You don't need to decide anything today, he left. Mabel stood at the window for a long time. The twist in all of it, the thing she had not allowed herself to see coming, arrived not from Elias's direction but from Calvin Roswell's. It was a Monday, 2 weeks after the incident. She was at the north fence when she heard a wagon on the road and looked up and saw something that stopped her completely. Walter Grayson's wagon. Walter Grayson was 73 years old, had ranched the Northern Valley for 40 years. and was the specific kind of man that Western Territory trees produced occasionally, someone whose word was so consistently proven that it had become the benchmark against which other men's words were measured. He had mentored half the ranchers in the county, including Elias, whom he had taken under his guidance in the hard years after Clara and Rose died. He had never, in Mabel's 4 months in Red Creek, come to her property. He stopped his wagon at her gate and looked at her with the direct assessing eyes of a man who had been reading people for 7 decades. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Grayson," she said. "I don't believe you've been out this way before." "I haven't," he said. "I'm not a man who involves himself in other people's business as a rule." He looked at her steadily. "But I'm making an exception today, because what I have to say affects more than other people's business. It affects whether this valley does right by 2 decent people, or whether it lets one bad actor set the terms for everyone else." Mabel walked to the gate. "Say what you came to say," she said. He did. What Walter Grayson told her in the next 20 minutes rearranged the shape of what she thought she understood about the past 4 months. He told her that Calvin Roswell's campaign against her had never been solely about her. It had been about the Hartwell property, specifically about the water rights attached to it, which connected to the creek that fed 3 of the major properties in the valley, including Calvin's own warehouse operation. Calvin had tried to purchase the Hartwell property himself before Mabel bought it. He had been outbid by her with her $43 and a credit arrangement that the seller had preferred over Calvin's cash offer because the seller had disliked Calvin for 20 years. Calvin's cruelty toward Mabel was personal. Yes, he was a man who felt contempt for anyone he deemed beneath his station. But it was also strategic. A woman like Mabel, building a successful homestead and establishing water rights, was a long threat to his control of the local water access. If he could drive her out through social pressure before she fully established her legal standing, he stood to acquire the property through a distressed sale. "He's been trying to run you off your land," Walter said. Using the town as his instrument, Mabel looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know what you're actually fighting," he said. "And because Elias Whitaker has been sitting in my kitchen for the past 3 evenings, unable to eat a full meal, and I am done watching a good man punish himself for a mistake he knows how to correct." He looked at her straight. "He's not the enemy, Miss Hartwell. Calvin Roswell is. And 2 people fighting on the wrong side of the right battle is a waste this valley can't afford." She absorbed it all in the silence that followed. "What did you tell Elias?" she said. "I told him the same thing I'm telling you," Walter said. "I told him you didn't lose her because she wasn't enough. I told him he almost lost her because he was too afraid at the wrong moment to admit she was exactly what he needed." He paused. "He's known that since the moment you walked away from that street. He just needs to prove it in a way that earns the right to be believed." She looked at the gate between them. She looked at her own hands on the fence post. Calloused and strong and capable of building things that lasted. "He has to come himself," she said. "Whatever he's going to do, he has to come himself. I won't be brought to him. I won't be negotiated with through intermediaries." "I know," Walter said. "I told him that too." He touched his hat and drove back up the road. Mabel stood at the gate for a long moment after the wagon was gone. Her chest was doing that complicated thing again. The door was still shut. But she was aware she could not pretend otherwise of the light coming through the gap at the bottom of it. He came on a Wednesday, not a Tuesday. Not a Thursday, not one of the established days, the safe and practical days with their built-in justification of working arrangement and reasonable purpose. A Wednesday which had no justification except that he had decided to come. She heard Bishop on the road before she saw him, and she kept working. She was at the garden, checking the winter covers, and she kept her eyes down on the work, and she heard him stop at her gate and dismount, and she heard him stand there. He didn't call her name, he didn't say anything. She looked up. He was standing at her gate with his hat in both hands, turning it the same way he'd held it in the barn that first time, with the same deliberate gravity of a man who had removed his hat as an act of intention rather than habit. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the quiet steadiness, not the careful attention. Something rawer than those, something that had the look of a man who had already lost something, and was standing at the exact place where he'd lost it, trying to figure out whether there was anything left to pick up. She walked to the gate. She did not open it. She stood on her side and he stood on his, and she looked at him. "I've been thinking about what I'm going to say for 2 weeks," he said. "I've had Walter Grayson listening to 4 different versions of it. None of them were right." "Then don't say a version," she said. "Say the true thing." He looked at her. "I was a coward," he said. "On that street. I have been a coward before, with Francis, with Clara, with every situation in my life where being honest about what I felt would have cost me something in front of people who were watching. I have a long history of choosing what looked acceptable over what was real." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "I swore after Clara died that I was done living that way. And I meant it, and I failed it, at the one moment where it mattered most, with the one person I could least afford to fail." Mabel held his gaze. "You made me small," she said. "In front of all of them, I know." "In front of her," she said. "I know. I'm sorry, Mabel. Not a sorry that expects anything from you." He stopped. "Just the true thing. I'm sorry. What I did was wrong, and I've known it every minute since." She looked at him, at the hat in his hands turning, at the lines around his eyes, deeper than usual, with something she recognized as real and unperformed exhaustion. "Walter told me about the water rights," she said. "About what Roswell has been after." Something shifted in Elias's face. "I found out last week. I should have looked into his motivations sooner. I knew he had a pattern of running people off property he wanted, and I didn't." He stopped. "I didn't look hard enough because I was too focused on managing my own fear to think strategically about yours." "That's honest," she said. "I'm trying," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did you do about it?" He met her eyes. "I went to the county land office in Billings on Monday. I documented your water rights with the territorial registrar, full legal establishment, which means Roswell can't make a claim, regardless of what happens to the property ownership. Your access to that creek is now on record in Billings and in Helena both." Mabel stared at him. "You did that," she said. "It needed doing," he said. "It should have been done months ago, and I'm sorry it wasn't. That's my property," she said, "my business, my rights." "They are," he said, "and they're protected now. I didn't do it to manage your affairs. I did it because Roswell was using a legal gap to threaten something you built honestly, and I had the connections to close that gap, and you had the right to have it closed." He held her gaze. "If I overstepped, I'm sorry for that too." She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked past him, at the road, at the valley beyond, at the wide Montana sky going gray with approaching winter. "He went to the Merchant Association meeting," she said. "And named Calvin." "Yes, and resigned from the committee." "Yes, Walter says you haven't been sleeping." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more like a man who had been caught at something and was choosing honesty over dignity. "Walter talks too much for a man his age." "Walter talks exactly enough," she said. She looked at the gate between them. She thought about the door inside her, shut, closed, heavy. She thought about the gap at the bottom with the light coming through. She thought about 28 years of being the woman things didn't happen to, and about the specific terror of being wrong about this, and about what it would cost her to open the gate. She thought about what it had already cost her to keep it shut. She unlatched the gate. She stepped back from it. She did not open it. She unlatched it and stepped back, which was not the same as opening it, but was not the same as keeping it locked either. "There's a fence post on the south side that needs resetting," she said. The frost heaved it. He looked at the unlatched gate. He looked at her. "I see that," he said quietly. "I'm not saying everything is repaired," she said. "I'm saying there's a fence post that needs work, and you know how to work a fence post." "I do," he said. She stopped, breathed. The words were hard to get out, not because they weren't true, but because they were, completely, and she had spent so long protecting herself from the cost of true things. "I'm saying that I know what it is to be afraid. I know what it is to choose the safe thing over the real thing, because the real thing is terrifying, and the safe thing at least won't cost you what you can't afford to lose again." He was very still. "I've been doing it my whole life," she said. "Choosing the safe thing, and I told myself it was wisdom. I told myself it was self-protection, and some of it was." She looked at him. "But some of it was just fear, and I am so tired of living inside my own fear, Elias. I am so tired." He pushed the gate open. He came through it. He stopped 2 feet from her, the hat still in both hands, and he looked at her with that expression, raw, undefended, the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and he said, very quietly, "Tell me what I have to do." "Keep showing up," she said. "The way you did before, except honestly this time. Not as a working arrangement. Not as neighbors helping each other through a difficult season. As what it actually is." "What is it?" She looked at him. She let herself look fully and without flinching at the gray at his temples, and the exhaustion around his eyes, and the hat turning in his hands, and the 11 years of a man who had been trying to figure out how to come back to life after he was sure he'd lost everything worth living for. "Something real," she said. He exhaled that same exhale she'd heard before, the one that meant he'd been holding something he hadn't known how to put down. "Something real," he said. "Yes." He reached out slowly, telegraphing every inch of it, giving her every opportunity to step back, and he took her hand. Both of them calloused, both of them work-worn, his large and slightly rough. Hers strong in the way of someone who had been building things alone for longer than she should have had to. He held it, not tightly, not with any pressure, just held it the way you held something you were finally admitting you didn't want to put down. She let him. The fence post on the south side took 20 minutes to reset. They worked on it together in the cold November air, neither of them saying much, the way they had always worked best in the productive silence of two people who understood each other without requiring translation. When it was done, Elias said, "I need to tell you something else." She looked at him. "I went to the general store yesterday," he said. "Calvin Roswell was outside, and I want to tell you what I said to him, because you should hear it from me." She waited. "I told him that what he had done to you, to your property, to your standing in this town, was a deliberate campaign of cruelty designed to serve his own financial interests at the expense of a woman who had done nothing to deserve any of it." He said it with the same quiet force she'd heard from him before, the force that was more controlled than anger and therefore more powerful. "I told him that I had filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Authority, documenting his interference with your water rights. And I told him that if he directed one more comment or action toward you or your property, I would pursue every legal avenue available to me to ensure that his interference was made part of the public record." Mabel stared at him. "You did that publicly?" she said. "On the main street," he said. "Samuel Pruitt was there. Henderson was there. 3 men from the Merchant Association were there." She was quiet. "I should have done it in October," he said. "I should have done it the first time he opened his mouth. I'm not asking you to give me credit for doing it late. I'm just stopped. I'm telling you the truth. Which is what I should have been doing from the beginning." She thought about standing on that street in October with the whole town watching, and the word practical hitting her in the chest like something thrown. She thought about a man going to Billings on a Monday and filing paperwork he didn't have to file. She thought about a letter to a merchant association that named names and called cruelty by its actual name. She thought about a gate unlatched. "I'm not forgiving everything in a day," she said. "I want you to understand that. What happened on that street?" "I know," he said. "It's going to take time. I know that too. And I need you to understand." She stopped, steadied. "I need you to understand that if it happens again, if you choose what they expect over what's real, I won't come back from it. I don't have another one of those in me." He looked at her with those eyes that she had learned to read over 4 months of working silences and porch coffees and long evenings in the Montana dark. "I understand," he said, "and I'm going to tell you something that's either brave or stupid, and you can decide which." "Tell me." "I love you," he said. "I've known it since the evening on the porch when you told me about the child you lost, and you said you didn't say it to ask for anything. That was the moment I knew. He held her gaze completely, without flinching. I am not saying that to pressure you or to short-circuit the time it's going to take or to make myself feel better about what I did. I'm saying it because you asked me to be honest, and that is the most honest thing I have. Mabel stood in the November cold with his words in the air between them. She felt them land. She felt the full weight of them and the terror of them. And underneath the terror, something else, something that was warm and specific, and entirely with the apologetic quality that had always characterized her own inner life when it came to wanting things. She wanted this. She had wanted it for longer than she'd admitted, and she was done pretending otherwise. Then show up Thursday, she said, and we'll see where it goes from there. Something moved through his face, relief, and something more than relief. Something deeper, the look of a man who had been walking back towards something in the dark and had finally seen the light. Thursday, he said, and bring your own coffee this time, she said. I've been providing the coffee for months, and it's unequal. The laugh that came out of him was surprised and full, and the most genuine sound she had heard from him. It did the same thing to his face that it had done before, made him younger, more real, more entirely himself. Fair enough, he said. She looked at him. Go home, Elias, she said. You look like you haven't slept in 2 weeks. I haven't, he said. Then go home and sleep, she said, and come back Thursday. He touched his hat with warmth in it this time. Real warmth, the kind that had been building for 4 months and had nowhere left to hide. He went through the gate. She watched him mount Bishop and turn toward his property, and she stood at her unlatched gate in the cold, and she felt the door inside her, the one she had built over 28 years of being, the woman things didn't happen to swing open. Not all the way, not yet, but open enough to let the light through. Open enough to breathe. She turned back to her property. Her solid cabin, her protected garden, her winterized well. Everything she had built with her own hands from nothing. She picked up her tools. She kept working. But for the first time since she'd arrived in Red Creek, Montana, the silence around her work didn't feel like the silence of a person who was alone. It felt like the silence before something began. Thursday came with the first real snow of the season. Not a heavy snow, just a thin, dry dusting that settled on the hardpan and the fence posts and the winter-covered garden rows and made everything look both cleaner and more fragile than it actually was. Mabel was at the when she heard Bishop on the road, and she felt the thing in her chest that she had stopped trying to suppress, because suppressing it had proven to be more exhausting than simply allowing it to exist. He came through the gate with a tin coffee pot in one hand and his hat pulled low against the cold. You said bring your own, he said. I did, she said. He held up the pot, made enough for 2. She looked at him. At the pot, at the snow settling on his hat brim and shoulders. At the particular quality of his face in the thin winter light, open, in a way it hadn't been before October, the way a window looked different when it was actually letting air through instead of just pretending to. There are cups in the cabin, she said. They had coffee on the porch in the cold, which was either practical or foolish depending on how you looked at it, and neither of them addressed which it was. They drank it standing, because sitting in the cold felt like a commitment to staying, that neither of them had yet made explicitly, and the standing was honest in that particular way. We are here. We are not running. We have not yet decided what comes next, but we are not pretending the cold isn't cold. Roy wants to know if you need help with the winter fencing, Elias said. I finished the winter fencing on Tuesday, she said. He looked at her. You finished it alone. I've been finishing things alone for 4 months, she said. Roy's offer is appreciated. Tell him I said so. He was quiet for a moment. You're not going to make this easy, are you? She looked at him over her cup. Was it supposed to be easy? No, I suppose not. He drank his coffee. Good. Easy things don't last in Montana, he said. The things that hold are the ones that cost something to build. She thought about her cabin walls, her well at 11 feet. Her garden rows under their careful winter cover. Everything that had cost her something and held anyway. That's true, she said. They went to work. The rhythm that returned between them was the same as before in structure, but different in quality, deeper, more deliberate. The way a piece of wood that had been tested for weakness and survived came out stronger for the testing. Elias was there Tuesdays and Thursdays without exception, and sometimes he stayed later than the work required, and sometimes the conversations on the porch went longer than either of them planned. And neither of them remarked on this because remarking on it would have required them to define something they were still in the process of becoming. What changed was the honesty. He told her things he hadn't told her before. About Francis, not just the bare fact of the broken engagement, but the shape of what it had done to him, how it had taught him to anticipate abandonment so thoroughly that he had started abandoning first, preemptively, as a form of self-protection. He told her about the years after Clara and Rose, when the ranch had been the only thing he could make himself care for, because the ranch couldn't die of fever and couldn't leave him, and how he had slowly and deliberately made himself into a man who wanted nothing that could be taken away. Until you, he said, one evening on the porch, in the flat, honest way he had when he was saying something that cost him. Mabel was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I bought $43 worth of land and dug an 11-foot well. I am not the kind of woman who leaves." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "No," he said, "you're not. But I need you to understand something," she said. "What you did on that street, calling it a practical arrangement, that wasn't just about me. That was about every person who ever looked at me and decided I was a temporary thing. A convenience. Something you used until something better came along." She held his gaze. "I have been that woman my whole life, and I will not be that woman again. Not for anyone, not even for you, I know," he said. "I understood that before you walked off that street. I understood it the moment the words left my mouth." "Then why?" "Because I was terrified," he said, "not of Calvin Roswell. Not of the town. Terrified of what it meant that you mattered to me that much. Terrified that saying it out loud in front of everyone made it real in a way that real things can be taken." He paused. "And I made the worst possible choice to manage that terror. I made you smaller to make myself feel safer, and I have not forgiven myself for it." She looked at her hands. "Neither have I," she said. "Entirely," he said. "I'm not asking you to." Another silence. "Keep showing up," she said. "That's what forgiveness looks like for me. Not a declaration, not an apology. Just keep being what you've been these past 3 weeks. Honest, present, consistent." She looked at him. "That's what I need." "Then that's what you'll have," he said. Calvin Roswell made one final attempt in early December. Mabel heard about it afterward. She was not present for it, which was perhaps why it went the way it went. Elias was in town for a supply order when Calvin approached him outside the feed merchant and made a comment that aided his concern for a friend, but was constructed, as all of Calvin's cruelties were, to cut precisely where it would do the most damage. "You know she'll never be accepted here," Calvin said. "Not really. Whatever you think you're building with her, the decent families of this town will never receive her as an equal. You're throwing away your standing for a woman who will always be what she is." The men who were present told Henderson what happened next, and Henderson told Mabel, and the telling had the quality of something that would be repeated for years in the valley. Elias turned and looked at Calvin Roswell with the level, specific attention of a man who had made peace with something and was no longer afraid of the consequences. "I'm going to tell you something plain," he said, "so there's no confusion between us going forward." Calvin's expression shifted. Something in Elias's voice was different from before, not heated, not defensive, not managing anything. Just clear. Mabel Hartwell built a functioning homestead from a condemned property in 4 months alone, with $43 and more determination than anyone in this town has shown in 20 years, Elias said. She diagnosed a drainage problem I'd been fighting for 6 years inside of 20 minutes. She has more intelligence, more integrity, and more genuine strength than any person I have encountered in 11 years of living in this valley. He paused. What she is, Calvin, is exactly what this valley needs and has been too small to recognize. And what I am is a man who is done letting your opinion of her stand without correction. Calvin opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," Elias said. If you say one more word about her standing or her appearance or her suitability for anything in public and private, to my face or behind my back, I will pursue the legal complaint I filed with the territorial authority until it costs you something you cannot recover. That is not a threat. That is a statement of intent. We understand nothing. Good, Elias said. He picked up his supply order. Good day, he walked away. When Henderson told Mabel all of this, she was very quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He didn't tell me. He didn't want credit for it," Henderson said. "He told me specifically not to make a point of telling you." She looked at Henderson. "Then why are you telling me?" Henderson smiled the small, careful smile of a man who had watched this story from close enough to understand its shape. "Because you deserve to know that someone stood up for you when you weren't there to see it. And because some things should be witnessed even when the person doing them would rather they weren't." Mabel looked at the window, at the winter outside. "He didn't do it for credit," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Henderson said. "He did it because it needed doing." She thought about that. About the difference between doing something because it made you look good and doing something because it was right, even when no one who mattered to you was watching. She had spent her whole life knowing that difference from the receiving end. It was something different entirely to be on the other side of it. The proposal did not happen the way Mabel would have written it if she'd been the kind of woman who let herself imagine such things which she had not been, not for 28 years. Not since she'd learned that imagining particular futures was one of the more efficient ways to destroy yourself. It happened on a Tuesday in February, which was an ordinary day in every respect except that by the end of it everything was different. They had been working the south barn, reinforcing the interior framing against the weight of the winter's accumulated snow. It was hard and close work, the kind that required two people to do well, one holding, one driving, and they had developed over months the particular wordless efficiency of people who knew each other's physical rhythms well enough to work without constant instruction. He was holding the beam, she was driving the peg. The work was loud and then it was quiet, and in the quiet he said her name. She looked at him across the beam. He was looking at her with that expression she had learned, over 7 months, the full, unhurried attention that saw past everything and landed directly on the part of her she'd kept covered longest. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something," he said. She lowered the mallet, plain. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because I need someone to manage this valley with. Not because I'm lonely or afraid of being alone, or because it would settle the talk in town or any other practical reason." He looked at her steadily. "Because you are the most honest person I have ever known. Because working beside you is the first time in 7 years I've felt like I was actually living instead of just maintaining. Because I want to keep showing up to your gate, Mabel, for the rest of my life." Not Tuesdays and Thursdays, every day she looked at him. The beam was between them. Both their hands were on it. "Calloused, work-worn, strong, Elias," she said. "I know it's fast," he said. "I know there's still." "It's not fast," she said. "It's been 7 months, and before that it was 28 years of me telling myself that things like this didn't happen to women like me." "They do," he said. "I know that now," she said. He waited. She looked at the beam between them. She looked at her hands. She thought about $43 and an 11-foot well, and a cabin she had shored up with her own labor, and the particular silence she had felt on that porch in the first days after she'd told him not to come back, the silence of a woman who had finally let herself be known and then had the thing she'd known taken back. She thought about the gate unlatched. She thought about Thursday, with his coffee pot in his hand in the snow. She thought about Roy saying lighter and Margaret Whittaker saying the first person who took him seriously, and Henderson saying he did it because it needed doing. She thought about 2 seconds of hesitation on a street in October and what had been built on the other side of it, not despite the mistake, but through the reckoning with it. The truth-telling that came after, the naming of names. The paperwork in Billings, the main street in December when no one who mattered was watching. She had said, "Keep showing up. That's what forgiveness looks like." He had kept showing up every time, without exception. Yes, she said. The word was simple and complete, and she meant every letter of it. He exhaled that exhale, the one she'd first heard when she took the October wildflowers from his hands, the sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding far too long. He came around the beam. He took her hands, both of them, calloused and strong in his, and he looked at her in the dim February barn, with the snow pressing quiet against the boards, and he said nothing for a moment, because there was nothing that needed saying. Then he said very quietly, "I don't want someone who looks perfect beside me. I want someone who stands beside me when life is difficult." She looked up at him. "You've seen difficult," she said. "So have you," he said. "Then we should be fine," she said. He smiled, the full one, the one that made him younger and more real and entirely himself. "We should be," he agreed. They were married in April, on a Saturday that came in warm and clear after a brutal winter, the kind of spring day Montana occasionally produced, as if it was apologizing for the months before it. The ceremony was small. Walter Grayson stood for Elias, and Henderson's wife Martha stood for Mabel, and the circuit preacher said what circuit preachers said, and it was done. Calvin Roswell was not there. He had quietly withdrawn from the Merchant Association Committee in January, after the Territorial Land Authority had opened a formal review of water rights claims in the valley. The review had found 2 instances of improper interference with established water access, both tracing back to Roswell's commercial interests. The findings were public record. They would remain public record. The valley's opinion of him had undergone a revision that he had not anticipated and could not reverse with smooth merchants talk. He was still in Red Creek. He still ran his store. But he was quieter than he had been, and the particular pleasure he had taken in managing other people's standing had lost most of its audience. Ida Pruitt came to the wedding. She arrived alone, without Samuel, and she sat at the back, and she brought a covered dish apple pie, same as before, and she set it on the table with the other food, without saying anything to anyone about it. When the ceremony was over and people were eating and talking in the warm April air, she came to Mabel and said simply, "I'm sorry I didn't do more when it mattered." Mabel looked at her for a moment. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wanted to," Ida said. "I want you to know that." "I know," Mabel said. "It was not full reconciliation. It was not the beginning of a friendship. It was one woman acknowledging to another that she had watched a cruelty she could have interrupted and had chosen not to, and it was the other woman receiving that acknowledgement without either exonerating or condemning. It was human and imperfect and real, which was the most any of it could be. Francis Aldercott sent a letter from Bozeman. It arrived 2 days before the wedding, addressed to Mabel, which surprised her. It said simply that she wished them well, and that she hoped Mabel understood that whatever her role in the situation had been, she had not intended harm. It said one other thing, one line at the end, written in a careful, deliberate hand that Mabel read twice and then folded carefully and kept. "He never looked at me the way I saw him look at you on that street. I think he was always waiting for someone he hadn't met yet. I'm glad he found her." Mabel put the letter in the tin box where she kept the documents that mattered: the deed, the water rights registration, the credit agreement with Henderson that had been the first proof that someone believed she could do what she said she could do. The letter went in with the rest of them, the records of what had been built and what it had cost and what it had proven. Margaret Whitaker arrived from Bozeman the week after the wedding. She stayed for 10 days, which was long enough for Mabel to understand what Elias had meant when he said his mother managed things, and long enough for Margaret to understand that managing Mabel Hartwell was not possible and had never been on offer. The morning Margaret left, she stood at Mabel's kitchen table and looked at her with those sharp, assessing eyes, and she said, "You're going to be good for him." "He's going to be good for me," Mabel said. Margaret smiled, and it was Elias's smile. The real one, the one that changed the whole face. "Yes," she said, "that's what I mean." She went back to Bozeman, and the house was quiet in the way it was now always quiet, the good kind, the inhabited kind. The kind of silence that existed between two people who had found their rhythm and no longer needed to fill every space to prove they were present. By the following summer, the Hartwell-Whitaker property, which was what people had begun calling the combined operation, the two ranches working together as they always had in practical terms, now made formal and legal, was the most productive spread in that part of the valley. The south pasture drained correctly finally, after 6 years of failed attempts and 1 winter of properly installed French drains designed on brown paper in careful, clear lines. The Hartwell cabin had been expanded, not replaced, expanded. Because Mabel was not the kind of woman who abandoned what she had built just because something larger was available, and the garden that had been a scraped-out plot of hardpan had become the kind of kitchen garden that people came to look at and ask about. Neighbors came to Mabel for advice now, not just farming advice, though they came for that too, and she gave it plainly and practically, and without making people feel small for not already knowing what she knew. They came because she had built something visible, something that could be pointed to and said, "That woman did that, and she did it starting with $43 in a deed, and nothing else except the refusal to stop." Women came especially. There was a woman in her 30s named Dorothea, who had arrived in Red Creek with 2 trunks and a plan and no connections, the same as Mabel had, and who had been met with the same particular quality of community skepticism. Mabel saw her on the road one morning, struggling with a wagon wheel, and pulled her horse over without being asked and helped fix it, and then stayed long enough to hear Dorothea's situation and give her Henderson's name and credit terms and advice on the hardpan soil and an open invitation to come back if she needed more. Elias watched this from a distance. "You're doing for her what I did for you," he said that evening. "No," Mabel said. "I'm doing for her what should have been done for me." "There's a difference." He looked at her. "What's the difference?" "I'm not asking for anything in return," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I asked for cooking and your opinion on the drainage." "You did," she said, "and it was a fair trade at the time. But that's not what she needs right now." She paused. "She needs someone to look at her and see a person with a plan who has every right to be here." "That's free. That costs me nothing." He looked at her for a long time. "You know," he said, "when I rode over that rise and saw you fighting that fence post up the shale slope, I thought I was going to help a woman who needed assistance." "I did need assistance," she said. "You needed a fence post carried," he said. The assistance ran mostly the other direction. He held her gaze. "I want you to know that I know that." She looked at him. "I know you know it," she said. "Good," he said. One evening in late summer, sitting on the porch in the warm dusk with the valley going gold around them, Elias said something that had been living in him for a long time. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said. "That first time in the barn, when you told me you weren't pretty." She was very still. "I want to say something about it," he said. "Not to contradict you or argue the point, just something true." She waited. "The women who are remembered in this valley," he said, "aren't the ones who were beautiful. They're the ones who did something, the ones who built something that lasted. The ones who stood at a gate when everything was burning around them and didn't move." He looked at her. "In 20 years, nobody's going to remember what anybody looked like. They're going to remember what got built, and what you built is going to outlast all of it, the opinions, the cruelty, the Calvin Roswells of the world." Mabel looked at the valley, at the summer evening going pink at the edges. She thought about the day she'd arrived in Red Creek. The freight wagon, the 2 trunks, the $43. The deed to a caved-in wreck that everyone had given up on. She thought about the woman who had sat on the floor of that wreck in her 19th day and cried because a rotten tomato had gotten through the armor. She thought about what that woman had built. "I know," she said quietly. "I know that now." He reached over and took her hand. She let him. They sat on the porch while the summer evening came down around them, and the valley settled into its night sounds, and there was nothing left to prove and nowhere else to be, and nothing that needed saying. Because some stories did not end with the most beautiful woman getting the life she deserved. Some stories ended with the most honest woman building the life she had always been capable of, and finally having someone beside her who understood the difference between those two things and had chosen every single day since a fence post on a shale slope to act accordingly. Mabel Hartwell had arrived in Red Creek with nothing but determination and the refusal to stop. She left nothing behind but proof of what that was worth. And in the valley of Red Creek, Montana, in the summer of 1885, that proof was everywhere you looked: in the drained pasture, in the solid walls, in the deep well at 11 feet. In every neighbor who came to her door and was met with plain, honest help and an open hand. The woman, they said, was too heavy, too plain, too damaged to ever be loved, had built something that outlasted every word they said about her. That was not a small thing. That was everything.